What if the true origin of the battle between light and darkness wasn't religious, but psychological? Picture this: a solitary priest tending a sacred flame under a desert sky, somewhere in the windswept steppes of ancient Iran. The year could be 1700 BCE or 600 BCE. Scholars still can't agree, and that's not a small gap. That's the difference between pre-Homer and post-Babylon. Why does his origin vanish just when empires began writing things down? This priest, Zarathustra, claimed he received direct revelations from the supreme deity Ahura Mazda. But these weren't gentle parables or moral guidelines. They were 17 cryptic hymns called the Gathas, songs that described an epic cosmic war between truth and deception, light and darkness, playing out simultaneously in the heavens above and within the human soul. But here's what makes this mystery extraordinary. Despite influencing virtually every major religious tradition that followed, from Judaism's concepts of heaven and hell to Christianity's final judgment, from Islamic eschatology to Buddhist cosmic cycles, the original Gathas disappeared from accessible human knowledge for centuries. The language died. The meanings became obscured. When a young French scholar named Abraham Anquetil Duperron finally brought the first European translation back from India in 1771, critics dismissed it as too bizarre to be authentic ancient wisdom. Yet modern archaeological and linguistic analysis has confirmed that these enigmatic verses represent one of humanity's oldest preserved religious texts, predating the Hebrew Bible and containing theological concepts that wouldn't appear in Western thought for centuries. Today we're going to explore how these lost hymns may have encoded the world's first systematic approach to what we now call shadow work, inner alchemy, and the transformation of consciousness through sacred fire, and why their rediscovery might hold keys to understanding both ancient mysticism and modern psychological healing. The first puzzle surrounding Zarathustra's Gathas isn't their content. It's whether their supposed author ever existed at all. Scholarly estimates for when Zarathustra lived span over a millennium, from 1700 BCE to 600 BCE. This isn't a minor dating disagreement. It's a fundamental uncertainty about whether we're dealing with a historical prophet or a mythological archetype that crystallized across generations of oral tradition. Mary Boyce, the British scholar who spent decades living among traditional Zoroastrian communities in Iran, argued that linguistic evidence points to around 1200 BCE, placing Zarathustra in the Bronze Age pastoral societies of Central Asia. Other scholars like Helmut Humbach place him much later, around 600 BCE, making him a contemporary of Buddha and Lao Tzu. But what if this dating controversy isn't an academic failure? What if it's exactly what we should expect from a figure whose teachings were designed to transcend ordinary historical time? Why does Zarathustra's timeline remain so mysterious? Because when empires began recording history, they wrote about kings and conquests, not about inner revolutions that happen in the silence of individual souls. The Persian bureaucrats who administered the vast Achaemenid Empire may have embraced Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic justice and moral law, but they weren't necessarily documenting the spiritual biography of the prophet who first glimpsed these truths in solitary vision. This historical silence creates its own kind of teaching. Scholars still can't agree if Zarathustra lived in 600 BCE or 1200 BCE, a gap that spans the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Greek historians claimed he lived 6,000 years before Xerxes' invasion, a number so vast it suggests they understood him more as an archetypal figure than a historical person. But what if that's exactly right? What if Zarathustra represents something that transcends ordinary biographical time? The eternal moment when human consciousness awakens to its own transformative power? The Gathas themselves offer tantalizing clues about their mysterious author. Imagine Zarathustra walking away from the traditional fire altars where his fellow priests offered sacrifices to multiple gods. Picture him alone in the wilderness, wrestling with visions that told him everything his religious training had taught him was incomplete. He speaks in the first person of feeling called to challenge the religious establishment of his time, not through political revolution, but through inner transformation. In one haunting passage, he describes the loneliness of his mission. "To what land shall I go to flee? Where shall I go to carry out my mission? They exclude me from family and tribe. The community I wish to join does not welcome me, nor do the rulers of the lands of falsehood." This isn't abstract theology. It's the anguished cry of someone who had seen too clearly to ever go back to comfortable illusions. But then comes the moment that changed everything. Zarathustra describes meeting Ahura Mazda directly, not in a temple built by human hands, but in the sacred fire of his own consciousness. "When I conceived of you in my mind as the first and also the last, as the one worthy of worship, as the father of good mind, then did I perceive you with my eyes, creator of truth, Lord of actions in life." This is the birth of a new kind of spirituality, not inherited from priests or learned from books, but discovered through direct inner experience. The traditional Iranian religion that Zarathustra reformed was dominated by powerful priestly castes who controlled elaborate ritual systems designed to placate multiple deities. These magi, the same word that gives us magic and magician, maintained their authority through complex ceremonies, astronomical knowledge, and inherited religious lore. Into this established system, Zarathustra introduced something unprecedented: the idea that each individual could have direct access to ultimate truth through personal revelation and moral choice. This wasn't simply religious reform, it was spiritual revolution. Zarathustra taught that the highest deity, Ahura Mazda, wise Lord, was directly accessible to anyone willing to align themselves with truth and righteousness, regardless of their social status or ritual knowledge. He proclaimed that cosmic salvation depended not on priestly mediation or ceremonial correctness, but on individual choices made in the privacy of one's own consciousness. But what did those teachings actually say about the inner fire that could transform human consciousness? And how could hymns composed for Bronze Age nomads contain psychological insights that resonate with modern depth psychology? The answer lies in understanding that Zarathustra wasn't just reforming religion. He was describing a technology of consciousness, a systematic method for recognizing and integrating the opposing forces within the human psyche. This is where the mystery deepens, because the Gathas describe these psychological processes using cosmic metaphors that have been misunderstood for over 2 millennia. The linguistic evidence adds another layer to this puzzle. Old Avestan, the dialect in which the Gathas were composed, shows striking similarities to Rigvedic Sanskrit, suggesting that Zarathustra emerged from the same Indo-European cultural matrix that produced the earliest Hindu scriptures. Yet the theological content of the Gathas represents a radical departure from Vedic polytheism. How did a priest trained in traditional Indo-Iranian religion develop such revolutionary insights about consciousness and moral choice? Was he working from earlier mystical traditions that have been lost to history? Or did he achieve genuine breakthrough insights through direct visionary experience? Zarathustra's hymns may be linguistically challenging, but their core message rings clear across millennia. Human consciousness is the real battleground where cosmic forces meet. The 17 hymns aren't arranged randomly. They follow 5 distinct rhythmic patterns that scholars trace back to Indo-European shamanic traditions. These weren't meant to be read silently in a library, but chanted around sacred fires, using specific melodies that could alter consciousness and provide access to normally hidden aspects of the psyche. The structure of the Gathas themselves provides the first clue to their deeper purpose. They're arranged in 5 groups based on different metrical patterns: the Ahunavaiti Gatha, Ushtavaiti Gatha, Spenta Mahinyu Gatha, Vohu Kshatra Gatha, and Vahishtoishti Gatha. Each group follows specific rhythmic patterns that scholars trace back to Indo-European mantic traditions, forms of inspired poetry used by priestly seers to express direct mystical experience. Unlike prose compositions designed to convey information clearly, these metrical structures were crafted to induce altered states of consciousness in both the reciter and the listener. The linguistic sophistication of these hymns is staggering. Professor Martin Schwartz has identified parallel clusters of lexic, semantic, and phonic data, which occur in concentric rings throughout the Gathas. Complex patterns of sound, meaning, and symbol that create multiple levels of significance within single verses. This isn't accidental. It represents a deliberate attempt to encode transformative spiritual knowledge in forms that could survive oral transmission while remaining accessible only to serious practitioners willing to engage deeply with their mysteries. But how do we crack the code of what these ancient verses actually mean? Consider this example from the Ahunavaiti Gatha. Through good mind, Ahura Mazda, grant me the 2 satisfactions of life, that in the most excellent way may come to pass all that is dependent on actions proceeding from good mind, that these, namely your rule and our devotion, O truth, may flourish. This seemingly simple prayer contains multiple layers of meaning that become apparent only through sustained contemplation. The 2 satisfactions refer simultaneously to material and spiritual well-being, present action and future consequences, individual development, and cosmic harmony. The central theme that runs through all 17 hymns is the fundamental choice between Asha, truth, chara, righteousness, and Druj, falsehood, deception. But this isn't simply moral instruction about good versus evil. The Gathas describe Asha and Druj as active spiritual forces that exist within every human being, requiring constant discrimination and conscious alignment. This is startlingly similar to what Carl Jung would later describe as the integration of shadow and light within the psyche. What makes this ancient psychological framework even more remarkable is how it connects individual inner work to cosmic transformation. The Gathas teach that human beings are not passive observers of a cosmic battle between good and evil. We are active participants whose choices literally influence the outcome of universal renewal. Every time an individual chooses truth over deception, light over darkness, they contribute to what Zarathustra called the renovation of the world. The concept of frashokareti, the final renovation of existence, represents one of Zarathustra's most revolutionary contributions to human thought. Unlike cyclical models of time found in most ancient cosmologies, the Gathas describe history as moving toward a definitive transformation where good triumphs permanently over evil, death is overcome by life, and the material world is purified and made perfect. But this cosmic healing depends entirely on human participation through conscious moral choice. This teaching about cosmic renovation influenced virtually every subsequent Western conception of historical progress, messianic salvation, and eschatological fulfillment. The idea that individual human actions contribute to universal healing would later appear in Jewish apocalypticism, Christian soteriology, and Islamic concepts of the Day of Judgment. Yet the Zoroastrian version remains unique in its emphasis on the psychological dimension of this cosmic transformation. But how exactly were these hymns supposed to facilitate this inner transformation? Here we encounter another layer of the mystery. The Gathas weren't written to be read silently. They were composed to be chanted using specific rhythms and melodies that have been preserved in Zoroastrian liturgical practice for over 3,000 years. Modern neuroscience suggests that repetitive chanting can induce altered states of consciousness, providing access to normally unconscious psychological material. The Gathas also employ what scholars call ring composition, circular structures where themes introduced at the beginning return at the end, but transformed through the intervening material. This creates a spiral rather than linear development of meaning, forcing the practitioner to hold paradoxes and tensions rather than resolving them prematurely. This technique appears in many wisdom traditions as a method for transcending conceptual thinking and accessing direct insight. The fire symbolism that permeates every Gatha provides perhaps the clearest indication of their psychological purpose. While later, Zoroastrian tradition focused on maintaining external sacred fires in temples, the Gathas consistently speak of the inner fire that burns within each person, the divine spark that can either illuminate consciousness or consume it in destructive passion, depending on how it's understood and directed. This inner fire represents what the Gathas call vohu manach, usually translated as good mind or good thought, but perhaps better understood as the illuminated awareness that can discriminate between truth and falsehood. It's the psychological faculty that makes conscious choice possible, the inner witness that can observe mental and emotional patterns without being identified with them. Could this explain why early scholars like Anquetil Duperron's critics found the Zoroastrian texts absurd and repetitive? They were expecting straightforward theology, but encountering something more like psychoactive poetry designed to catalyze inner experience rather than convey information. The fire that illuminates consciousness doesn't respond to intellectual analysis. It requires a different kind of engagement entirely. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Gathas story is what happened after they were composed. They virtually disappeared from accessible human knowledge for over a millennium, surviving only in the oral tradition of Zoroastrian priests, who gradually lost the ability to understand their original language. By the time Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 BCE, the Old Avestan dialect in which the Gathas were composed had already become archaic. Within a few centuries, it was essentially a dead language. This creates a profound historical puzzle. How could hymns that allegedly influenced the development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam during the centuries of Persian rule have transmitted their influence while remaining linguistically inaccessible? The answer may lie in understanding that the Gathas' most revolutionary ideas spread not through direct textual transmission, but through transformed religious practices and mystical traditions that preserved their essential insights in new forms. The process of this underground transmission began during the Achaemenid period, when Persian administrators and cultural ambassadors carried Zoroastrian concepts throughout the vast empire that stretched from India to Egypt. But these weren't necessarily learned priests who could explain theological subtleties. They were often merchants, soldiers, and civil servants who had absorbed Zoroastrian practices and worldviews without necessarily understanding their doctrinal foundations. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals fascinating traces of this cultural diffusion. Zoroastrian fire symbolism appears in Jewish synagogues from the Persian period. Persian architectural elements, incorporating winged figures and solar imagery, show up in early Christian churches. Manichaean texts discovered in Central Asia combine Zoroastrian dualism with Buddhist meditation techniques and Christian salvation theology, creating synthetic spiritual systems that preserved Gathic insights in radically new forms. During the Achaemenid period, 550 to 331 BCE, when Persian influence stretched from India to Egypt, key Zoroastrian concepts began appearing in Jewish apocalyptic literature, Christian eschatology, and various Gnostic movements. The idea of a final cosmic battle between good and evil, individual judgment after death, resurrection of the body, and the ultimate renovation of the world, all core themes from the Gathas, became foundational to later Western religious thought. But this influence was transmitted largely through practical mystical techniques rather than theological doctrines. The Zoroastrian emphasis on conscious moral choice, the transformation of consciousness through fire symbolism, and the integration of opposing forces within the soul found expression in various forms of ancient spiritual practice that didn't require direct access to the original Avestan texts. Perhaps the most significant example of this hidden transmission is Manichaeism, the religious movement founded by Mani in 3rd century Mesopotamia. Mani explicitly acknowledged Zarathustra as one of his prophetic predecessors and incorporated sophisticated versions of Gathic dualism into his own system. But Mani wasn't working from direct knowledge of the Gathas. He was synthesizing Zoroastrian concepts that had been filtered through several centuries of cultural transmission and theological development. Manichaeism spread rapidly across both the Roman and Persian empires. establishing communities from Spain to China and preserving many Zoroastrian insights about the relationship between cosmic and psychological transformation. Manichaean texts describe elaborate techniques for purifying consciousness through recognition of the light particles trapped within material existence, a sophisticated psychological system that clearly derives from Gathic teachings about the inner fire, but expressed in completely different theological language. The Manichaean communities developed what they called the call, practices for awakening the divine light within human consciousness that bear striking resemblances to later Sufi techniques for polishing the heart and Hasidic methods for kindling the divine spark. These communities maintained elaborate scholarly traditions that preserved not just Zoroastrian theological concepts, but also practical techniques for consciousness transformation that may have derived ultimately from the meditative use of the Gathas themselves. Why does this matter for understanding the inner fire tradition? Because it suggests that the deepest insights of the Gathas, their psychological techniques for recognizing and integrating opposing forces within consciousness, continued to develop and spread even while the original hymns themselves became increasingly mysterious. The flame of Zoroastrian wisdom was kept alive not in temple fires, but in the hearts and minds of mystics who understood that external religious forms were simply vehicles for inner transformation. This underground transmission may explain one of the most intriguing aspects of Zoroastrian influence: its tendency to appear in disguised or indirect forms throughout later religious and philosophical traditions. From Hermetic alchemy's emphasis on the union of opposites to Islamic Sufism's use of light and fire symbolism, from Christian mysticism's focus on inner purification to Jewish Kabbalah's cosmic dualism, traces of Gathic insight appear throughout the esoteric dimensions of Western spirituality. The Hermetic tradition that emerged in Hellenistic Egypt provides a particularly clear example of this hidden transmission. Hermetic texts describe the cosmos as a battleground between light and darkness, teach that human consciousness can be purified through gnosis, direct spiritual knowledge, and emphasize the individual's responsibility for cosmic healing through inner transformation. These core Hermetic themes mirror central Gathic teachings so closely that some scholars suspect direct historical connection, even though no textual links can be established. But what about the Gathas themselves? How did they survive the collapse of the Persian Empire, the rise of Islam, and over 1,000 years of cultural upheaval? The answer involves one of the most remarkable preservation efforts in human history: the determination of Zoroastrian priests to maintain exact oral transmission of texts they could no longer fully understand. By the time Islamic rule was established in Iran in the 7th century CE, Zoroastrianism had become a minority religion whose practitioners faced increasing pressure to convert or emigrate. Many fled to India, where they established the Parsi communities that would eventually preserve the Avestan texts until European scholars could rediscover them. These priests maintained elaborate training systems to ensure letter-perfect memorization of the ancient hymns, even though the original meanings had become largely opaque. The priests developed ingenious mnemonic techniques to preserve not just the words of the Gathas, but also their precise pronunciation, rhythm, and melody. They created elaborate systems of cross-references between different parts of the liturgy, ensuring that if any portion was lost or corrupted, it could be reconstructed from other preserved materials. They established rigorous testing procedures for young priests, requiring them to demonstrate perfect recall of thousands of lines of Avestan text before being ordained. This creates a fascinating paradox. The very obscurity that made the Gathas seem lost may have been what allowed them to survive. Because their language was incomprehensible to both Islamic authorities and casual converts, they posed no obvious threat to established orthodoxies. They could be preserved as ritual artifacts, while their revolutionary psychological insights remained safely hidden within their archaic poetry. In 1754, a 23-year-old French student named Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil du Perron made a decision that would change the course of religious scholarship forever. While studying Oriental languages at the Royal Library in Paris, he encountered fragments of ancient Avestan texts and became obsessed with finding their complete versions. When he learned that Zoroastrian communities in India still possess these texts, he made an extraordinary choice. He enlisted as a soldier in the French East India Company purely to gain passage to India, with the secret mission of becoming the first European to learn the Zoroastrian scriptures directly from their traditional guardians. What happened next reads like an academic adventure novel. Arriving in India in 1755, Anquetil du Perron faced enormous obstacles. The Parsi priests were reluctant to share their sacred texts with a foreign Christian. They had good reason for caution. Revealing religious secrets to outsiders was considered sacrilege, and the texts themselves were written in languages that even the priests barely understood. The ancient Avestan of the Gathas was so archaic that it required interpretation through medieval Persian commentaries, which themselves required explanation through Sanskrit glosses. Picture the scene. A young French adventurer, thousands of miles from home, trying to learn the most sacred secrets of an ancient religion through a chain of translation that spanned 3 millennia and 4 different languages. For 4 years, Anquetil du Perron persisted in learning this complex web of languages and traditions. He studied with Dastur Darab, a Parsi priest in Surat, communicating through Persian while attempting to understand Avestan texts that his teacher could translate only through medieval intermediaries. The challenges were staggering. Anquetil du Perron was essentially trying to reconstruct the meaning of Bronze Age religious poetry through a linguistic game of telephone that had been played for over 2,000 years. The priests themselves admitted they understood only fragments of what they had memorized so perfectly. They could recite every syllable with flawless accuracy, but the meaning had been lost in the mists of time. Despite these formidable challenges, Anquetil du Perron succeeded in collecting nearly 200 manuscripts and producing the first European translation of the complete Avesta, which he published in Paris in 1771 as Zund Avesta, Ouvrage de Zoroastre. The 3-volume work included not only translations of the Gathas and other Zoroastrian texts, but also detailed accounts of contemporary Parsi religious practices and Anquetil du Perron's own remarkable journey. But what was Europe's reaction to this unprecedented gift of ancient wisdom? The European scholarly reaction was immediate and devastating. Critics, led by the Orientalist William Jones, dismissed Anquetil Duperron's translation as an obvious forgery. How could ancient religious texts be so absurd, tedious, and repetitive? Surely no genuine prophet would have produced such bizarre and contradictory material. The attack was so systematic that it effectively discredited Zoroastrian studies for over half a century. But what if the European critics were missing the point entirely? They were judging the Gathas by the standards of rational theology and linear narrative, expecting them to resemble the Bible or classical philosophy. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented in European religious literature: mystical poetry designed to induce altered states of consciousness rather than convey systematic doctrine. In an anonymous attack, William Jones argued that Anquetil Duperron barely knew enough Persian to communicate with his informants, that the Parsi priests themselves barely understood their own texts, and that what he presented as the Zend Avesta was too absurd, tedious, and repetitive to be a genuine holy text. Johann Friedrich Klücker, Anquetil Duperron's German translator, responded brilliantly, "Must all that's old be wise as well?" He pointed out that presumed absurdity and tediousness didn't prove modern forgery. By the same criteria, much of the Hebrew Bible would seem equally bizarre to rational analysis. The controversy reveals a deeper cultural blindness. 18th century European scholars had no framework for understanding religious texts that functioned more like psychoactive technology than theological treatises. They couldn't recognize that the absurdity and repetition that bothered them might have been deliberate features designed to break down ordinary conceptual thinking and provide access to different states of awareness. For 60 years, the debate raged across European universities and academies. Anquetil Duperron died in 1805, still defending his work against critics who insisted that genuine ancient wisdom couldn't possibly be so strange and difficult to understand. The vindication came only in 1820, 15 years after his death, when the Danish philologist Rasmus Rask confirmed through linguistic analysis that the Avestan language was indeed an ancient Iranian dialect closely related to Sanskrit. Suddenly, the forged texts that had seemed too strange to be authentic were recognized as among the oldest religious documents in human history. The same features that critics had dismissed as evidence of modern fabrication: the archaic grammar, the repetitive structures, the deliberately obscure symbolism, were now understood as markers of genuine antiquity. This delayed recognition raises profound questions about how we evaluate ancient wisdom traditions. What other insights have been dismissed as absurd or primitive simply because they don't conform to modern expectations about how spiritual knowledge should be packaged? The Gathas' European reception suggests that genuinely transformative wisdom often appears nonsensical to cultures that have lost the keys to its proper interpretation. Modern scholars now recognize that Anquetil Duperron, despite working with imperfect materials and linguistic limitations, succeeded in preserving the essential spirit of Zoroastrian teaching, even where his specific translations were flawed. His achievement wasn't just academic, it was shamanic. He had traveled to the edge of the known world and brought back fire. But why did it take European scholars so long to recognize what Anquetil Duperron had actually accomplished? The answer may lie in understanding that the Gathas challenge some of our most basic assumptions about the relationship between ancient and modern wisdom, between rational analysis and mystical insight, between theological doctrine and consciousness transformation. They offer a model of spirituality that was too advanced for its time, and perhaps too advanced for ours as well. The greatest irony in the story of the Gathas may be that their deepest insights remained hidden in plain sight even after their rediscovery. For over a century, Western scholars approached Zoroastrian dualism as primitive theology, a crude attempt to explain the problem of evil through cosmic warfare between opposing deities. It took the emergence of depth psychology in the 20th century to reveal that Zarathustra's cosmic battle might actually be the world's first systematic description of what Carl Jung called the process of individuation. Jung himself was fascinated by Zoroastrian symbolism, particularly its sophisticated understanding of the shadow, those aspects of the personality that consciousness rejects or fails to recognize. In Jung's model, psychological health requires not the elimination of the shadow, but its conscious integration through a process he called holding the tension of opposites. This is remarkably similar to what the Gathas describe as the fundamental human task, maintaining awareness of the constant choice between asha, truth, and druj, deception, that occurs within every individual soul. But the Zoroastrian system goes even further than Jungian psychology by connecting individual shadow work to cosmic transformation. The Gathas teach that human consciousness is literally the battleground where universal forces of creation and destruction meet, and that conscious moral choices by individuals actually influence the outcome of cosmic evolution. This suggests an understanding of what we might now call morphic resonance, or collective unconscious transformation through individual psychological work. The fire symbolism that permeates Zoroastrian practice provides the key to understanding how this psychological transformation was supposed to occur. While most people associate Zoroastrianism with external fire temples and eternal flames, the Gathas consistently emphasize the inner fire that burns within human consciousness. This inner fire represents what modern psychology might call the observing self, the aspect of awareness that can witness and choose between competing psychological tendencies without being completely identified with any of them. In contemporary therapeutic language, this inner fire functions like the mindful witness that allows individuals to observe their thoughts, emotions, and behavioral patterns without being overwhelmed by them. It's the psychological space that makes choice possible, the gap between stimulus and response where freedom lives. The Gathas suggest that cultivating this inner fire requires constant practice in discriminating between truth and deception, not just in external ethical choices, but in the subtle movements of thought and feeling that precede all action. How does this ancient fire practice actually work in psychological terms? Consider what happens when someone experiences a powerful emotional reaction: anger, fear, jealousy, or desire. The ordinary response is either to be completely consumed by the emotion or to try to suppress it entirely. The Gathic approach suggests a third option: maintaining the inner fire of awareness that can witness the emotion without being identified with it, neither pushed around by it nor cut off from its potentially valuable information. This connects to what modern trauma therapy calls window of tolerance, the capacity to remain present and responsive even when experiencing intense emotional states. The Zoroastrian emphasis on good thoughts, good words, good deeds can be understood as ancient technology for expanding this window of tolerance by developing conscious relationship with the inner fire of awareness rather than being reactive to emotional or mental content. What makes this ancient psychology particularly sophisticated is its recognition that individual transformation is inseparable from collective healing. The Gathas teach that every time someone chooses truth over deception or light over darkness, they contribute to the eventual renovation of the world, the cosmic healing that represents the ultimate goal of human existence. This suggests an understanding of how individual shadow work contributes to broader social and ecological healing that wouldn't reappear in Western psychology until systems theory and transpersonal psychology emerged in the late 20th century. The deliberate ambiguity and poetic complexity of the Gathas now makes perfect sense from this perspective. They weren't meant to be understood intellectually, but to be worked with as meditation objects that could facilitate direct experience of the inner fire. Like Zen koans or Sufi poetry, their absurdity and repetition were designed to frustrate conceptual thinking and provide access to deeper levels of awareness. But why did this psychological dimension of Zoroastrianism remain hidden for so long? Part of the answer lies in understanding that the inner fire of consciousness cannot be transmitted through intellectual explanation alone. It must be discovered through direct experience. The priests who preserved the Gathas through oral tradition may have gradually lost touch with the contemplative practices that originally activated their transformative power. This interpretation explains why Zoroastrian influence spread so widely through later mystical traditions, despite the linguistic inaccessibility of the original texts. The essential insight that consciousness can be purified and expanded through conscious relationship with inner opposing forces didn't require preserved language to be transmitted. It could be rediscovered by any serious practitioner willing to engage with the fundamental dynamics of human psychology. The fire that burns in Zoroastrian temples represents something far more profound than religious symbolism. It's a mirror of the flame of consciousness that burns within every human being. The eternal flames that are never allowed to go out remind us that awareness itself is the most precious thing we possess, requiring constant attention and care to maintain its clarity and transformative power. Modern neuroscience has confirmed many of the insights that Zarathustra encoded in his fire imagery. The brain's capacity for neuroplasticity means that consciousness literally reshapes itself through the quality of attention we bring to our inner and outer experience. The discriminating awareness that the Gathas call vohu mana corresponds remarkably to what neuroscientists now recognize as the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotional reactivity and maintain conscious choice even under stress. In the 21st century, as ancient wisdom traditions meet modern neuroscience and therapeutic innovation, the psychological insights preserved in the Gathas are experiencing an unexpected renaissance. Contemporary research on neuroplasticity, mindfulness meditation, and trauma healing has revealed that the human brain's capacity for transformation through conscious attention aligns remarkably with what Zarathustra taught about the inner fire of awareness 3 millennia ago. The convergence begins with what neuroscientists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe and regulate one's own mental processes. This capacity, which forms the foundation of most modern therapeutic approaches, corresponds precisely to what the Gathas describe as vohumana, or good mind, the illuminated awareness that can discriminate between truth and falsehood, between thoughts that lead toward flourishing and those that lead toward destruction. Recent studies using brain imaging technology have shown that mindfulness practices literally rewire neural networks, strengthening connections between the prefrontal cortex, associated with conscious decision-making, and the amygdala, associated with emotional reactivity. This neuroplasticity research validates what Zoroastrian practitioners have maintained for millennia: that conscious attention to the quality of thoughts and emotions can fundamentally transform human consciousness. The Zoroastrian emphasis on moment-by-moment choice between truth and deception resonates strongly with mindfulness-based therapies that help individuals recognize the difference between reactive patterns and conscious responses. Modern cognitive behavioral therapies focus on observing and challenging automatic thoughts, echoes the Gathic practice of discriminating between asha and druj in the subtle movements of consciousness, the ancient fire that illuminates the darkness of unconscious reactivity. Sounds remarkably similar to what contemporary psychologists call metacognitive awareness. But perhaps the most striking contemporary parallel is in the field of trauma therapy, where practitioners have rediscovered the importance of what's called titration, the careful regulation of arousal levels to stay within the window of tolerance where healing can occur. This is essentially what Zoroastrian fire practice was designed to accomplish, developing the capacity to remain present and aware, even when experiencing intense inner states, neither being overwhelmed by them nor dissociating from them entirely. Trauma specialists like Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine have demonstrated that healing occurs not through eliminating difficult emotions, but through developing what they call dual awareness, the ability to experience challenging states while simultaneously maintaining contact with safety and choice. This dual awareness corresponds remarkably to the Gathic teaching about holding the tension between opposing forces while maintaining alignment with the inner fire of consciousness. The emerging field of positive psychology has also rediscovered ancient Zoroastrian insights about the relationship between individual well-being and collective flourishing. Martin Seligman's research on character strengths and authentic happiness echoes the Gathic emphasis on virtues like truth-telling, justice, and beneficence as fundamental to both personal fulfillment and social harmony. The Zoroastrian motto, "Good thoughts, good words, good deeds," anticipates by 3,000 years what positive psychology now describes as the integration of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral aspects of human flourishing. Contemporary systems thinking and ecological psychology have arrived at conclusions that mirror the Gathic vision of individual and cosmic transformation being inseparably connected. Complexity science has revealed how individual actions within complex systems can trigger widespread changes through what researchers call sensitive dependence on initial conditions, a scientific validation of the ancient Zoroastrian teaching that individual choices literally influence the outcome of cosmic evolution. The current global crisis of meaning and environmental destruction makes the Gathic vision of individual transformation contributing to cosmic renovation particularly relevant. Climate scientists increasingly recognize that addressing ecological challenges requires not just technological solutions, but fundamental shifts in consciousness that change how humans relate to the natural world. The Zoroastrian understanding that human choices literally influence the outcome of cosmic evolution anticipates insights about consciousness and collective resonance that are just beginning to emerge in cutting-edge scientific research. Modern Zoroastrian communities themselves are rediscovering these deeper dimensions of their tradition. Contemporary Parsi and Iranian Zoroastrian teachers are moving beyond the ritual focus that dominated recent centuries to explore the psychological and mystical dimensions of their ancient texts. Books like The Inner Fire, Faith, Choice, and Modern-Day Living in Zoroastrianism demonstrate how the Gathic teachings can be understood as practical guidance for contemporary spiritual development rather than merely historical artifacts. Judge Rohinton Nariman's analysis of the Gathas reveals how these ancient hymns address fundamental questions about consciousness, choice, and meaning that remain as relevant today as they were 3 millennia ago. His work demonstrates that when the Gathas are approached as living wisdom rather than archaeological curiosities, they offer sophisticated frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual transformation and collective healing that anticipate many insights of contemporary psychology and systems theory. And the renewed interest in psychedelic research also provides an unexpected lens for understanding the Gathas. The states of consciousness accessible through various plant medicines often reveal the same fundamental insights about the relationship between individual awareness and cosmic healing that Zarathustra encoded in his visionary hymns. This suggests that the inner fire of Zoroastrian practice may represent a non-pharmacological technology for accessing transpersonal states of consciousness that facilitate both personal healing and collective wisdom. Contemporary researchers studying the therapeutic applications of psychedelics have identified several key elements that characterize healing experiences. The dissolution of rigid ego boundaries, direct encounter with what feels like universal love or intelligence, and profound insights about the interconnectedness of all existence. These same elements appear consistently in accounts of mystical experience from practitioners working with the Gathic teachings about inner fire and cosmic transformation. The parallels extend to the integration phase of psychedelic therapy, where the challenge becomes translating transcendent insights into sustainable changes in everyday consciousness and behavior. This is precisely what the Zoroastrian emphasis on good thoughts, good words, good deeds was designed to accomplish, providing a practical framework for embodying spiritual insights in the details of ordinary life. What would it look like to apply Gathic principles to contemporary challenges like climate change, social inequality, and the mental health crisis? The Zoroastrian approach suggests that these apparently external problems cannot be solved without simultaneous inner work that transforms the consciousness from which they arise. Every choice to face truth rather than denial, to respond from awareness rather than reactivity, to choose regeneration rather than destruction, contributes to the collective evolution that the Gathas describe as inevitable, but requiring human participation. The Gathic vision of Fra Sciaccaretti, the final renovation of the world, offers a sophisticated framework for understanding how individual consciousness change relates to collective transformation. Unlike utopian fantasies that imagine external paradise without inner development, or purely individualistic spiritualities that ignore collective responsibility, the Zoroastrian model describes cosmic healing as emerging from the accumulated choices of conscious individuals who have learned to align with truth rather than deception. This framework provides valuable perspective on current debates about social change and political activism. The Gathic approach suggests that lasting social transformation requires not just changing external systems, but cultivating the inner fire of consciousness that can discriminate between policies and practices that serve life versus those that serve destruction. This isn't passive withdrawal from political engagement, but rather bringing contemplative clarity to the work of collective healing. The ancient fire temples of Zoroastrianism maintained eternal flames that were never allowed to go out, symbolizing the continuous presence of divine consciousness within material existence. In our modern context, this eternal flame might be understood as the ongoing requirement for conscious presence, the inner fire of awareness that must be continuously tended if human civilization is to successfully navigate its current evolutionary challenges. Contemporary neuroscience has revealed that the human brain's default mode network, the mental patterns that operate when we're not paying conscious attention, tends toward negativity bias, rumination, and self-referential thinking that often generates anxiety and depression. The Gathic practice of continuously choosing between truth and deception, light and darkness, can be understood as ancient technology for interrupting these default patterns and cultivating what researchers now call positive neuroplasticity. Perhaps this is why the Gathas remained hidden for so long. Their insights were too advanced for their time, preserved in linguistic obscurity until humanity had developed sufficient psychological sophistication to understand their true meaning. The same teachings that seemed absurd to 18th century European rationalists now appear remarkably prescient to 21st century depth psychologists and consciousness researchers. The integration of ancient wisdom and modern science suggests that we may be approaching a renaissance of understanding about consciousness and its role in both individual healing and collective transformation. The Gathic vision of human beings as conscious participants in cosmic evolution offers both inspiration and practical guidance for navigating the unprecedented challenges facing our species. As quantum physics reveals the fundamental interconnectedness of all existence, as psychology discovers the malleability of consciousness, as ecology demonstrates the sensitivity of complex systems to individual actions, the ancient Zoroastrian insight that personal choices influence cosmic outcomes appears less like primitive superstition and more like sophisticated understanding of how reality actually works. But how do we actually practice this ancient wisdom in contemporary life? The answer may be simpler than we think. Every moment offers the opportunity to choose between truth and deception, awareness and unconsciousness, healing and destruction. The inner fire that Zarathustra described isn't an exotic mystical achievement. It's the natural capacity for conscious choice that every human being possesses. The challenge isn't developing some special spiritual ability, but learning to recognize and trust the clarity that's already present. When we pause before reacting to a difficult situation, when we choose honesty over convenient deception, when we respond to conflict with curiosity rather than defensiveness. In these ordinary moments, we're practicing the same consciousness transformation that Zarathustra encoded in his mysterious hymns 3 millennia ago. And maybe, just maybe, what Zarathustra called the sacred flame was never out there in temple fires at all. Perhaps it was always the clarity that flickers inside us every time we choose truth over comfortable illusion, awareness over unconscious reaction, healing over destruction. The fire that never dies isn't maintained by priests in distant temples, but by anyone willing to tend the flame of conscious choice in the sanctuary of their own heart. The story of the Gathas reminds us that authentic spiritual knowledge has a way of preserving itself, even when its original forms are lost or forgotten. Like the eternal flames maintained in Zoroastrian fire temples, genuine wisdom finds ways to keep burning across millennia of cultural upheaval and linguistic transformation. The inner fire that Zarathustra kindled continues to burn in every human being who chooses consciousness over unconsciousness, truth over deception, healing over destruction. Whether we call it mindfulness, presence, the observing self, metacognitive awareness, or simply the capacity for conscious choice, this flame represents our species' most essential capability: the ability to step back from automatic reactivity and choose our response to whatever life presents. This is the technology of consciousness that the Gathas encoded in their cryptic poetry, not a primitive religious doctrine, but a sophisticated understanding of how awareness itself can be cultivated and directed toward both individual flourishing and collective healing. The modern rediscovery of Zoroastrian psychology suggests that ancient wisdom and contemporary science may be converging on similar insights about the nature of consciousness and its role in transformation. As neuroscience reveals the plasticity of the brain, as psychology discovers the malleability of mental patterns, as systems science demonstrates how individual actions influence collective outcomes, the Gathic vision of human beings as conscious participants in cosmic evolution appears less like mythological fantasy and more like practical instruction for our current evolutionary moment. The French scholar Anquetil Duperron, who risked everything to bring these texts back to European awareness, probably never imagined that his controversial translation would eventually be vindicated not just by linguistic scholarship, but by the emergence of therapeutic approaches that rediscovered ancient techniques for consciousness transformation. The absurd and repetitive qualities that 18th century critics dismissed as evidence of forgery now appear as sophisticated features designed to facilitate the kind of contemplative engagement that modern psychology recognizes as essential for lasting change. This suggests that we may still be in the early stages of understanding what the Gathas actually contain, As our scientific knowledge of consciousness expands, as our therapeutic understanding of trauma and healing deepens, as our ecological awareness of interconnection grows, we may discover that these ancient hymns encoded insights about the nature of reality that we are only beginning to appreciate. The concept of frashakareti, the cosmic renovation that represents the ultimate goal of Zoroastrian spiritual practice, offers a framework for understanding our current global challenges that transcends both naive optimism and cynical despair. The Gathic vision suggests that the transformation our planet desperately needs will emerge not from external technological fixes or political revolutions alone, but from the accumulated choices of individuals who have learned to tend the inner fire of conscious awareness. This doesn't mean withdrawing from practical engagement with the urgent challenges of our time. Rather, it suggests bringing contemplative clarity to that engagement, learning to respond from the place of inner fire, rather than react from unconscious patterns of fear, anger, or despair. Every moment when someone chooses truth over denial, compassion over hatred, regeneration over destruction, contributes to the collective evolution that the Gathas describe as both inevitable and requiring conscious human participation. The prophet who walked away from conventional religion to discover the inner fire of direct spiritual experience lit a torch that continues to burn wherever human beings dare to face themselves honestly and choose transformation over stagnation. His legacy isn't preserved in ancient manuscripts or ritual practices, but in every moment when consciousness awakens to its own luminous nature. In our current global moment, facing climate crisis, technological disruption, and widespread meaninglessness, Zarathustra's insight that personal and planetary healing are inseparable offers both hope and practical guidance. The renovation of the world he prophesied may not come through external salvation, but through the patient work of individuals who learn to kindle and tend the inner fire of awareness. The greatest mystery of the Gathas isn't their historical origins or linguistic complexity, but their continuing ability to awaken something timeless in anyone willing to listen. That sacred fire Zarathustra glimpsed in the wilderness of ancient Iran burns on in the wilderness of modern consciousness, waiting for each new generation to discover that the light they seek has been present all along, not as distant revelation, but as the very awareness through which they seek it. The fire that never dies is the light of consciousness itself, and it exists wherever you are right now, reading these words, making choices, participating in the cosmic adventure of awakening. This is Zarathustra's ultimate teaching. Not that salvation comes from outside, but that the divine flame you've been searching for is the very awareness that's been doing the searching all along. Perhaps the most remarkable discovery of our exploration is that the lost Gathas were never truly lost at all. They were hidden in plain sight, encoded not just in archaic Avestan poetry, but in the fundamental structure of human consciousness itself. Every time someone faces a difficult truth, instead of choosing comfortable denial, every time someone responds from awareness, instead of reacting from conditioning, every time someone chooses healing instead of destruction, they are practicing the essential teaching of the Gathas, that consciousness can be purified through conscious choice, and that individual transformation contributes to cosmic healing. The inner fire that Zarathustra taught is not an abstract metaphysical concept, but a practical reality available to anyone willing to pay attention to the quality of their thoughts, words, and deeds. It is the flame of awareness that illuminates the difference between truth and deception, the light of consciousness that can transform even the darkest aspects of human experience into opportunities for wisdom and compassion. In this light, every person who commits to consciousness over unconsciousness, every choice for truth over deception, every action guided by wisdom rather than reactivity, becomes part of the ancient lineage that extends back to the mysterious prophet who first sang these revolutionary hymns in the windswept steppes of Central Asia. The fire that Zarathustra lit continues to burn, waiting for each new generation to discover its transformative power and carry it forward into an uncertain but ultimately hopeful future. This exploration of Zarathustra's lost Gathas represents just the beginning of a mystery that continues to unfold. As more scholars decode the linguistic complexities of these ancient hymns, and more practitioners discover their psychological depths, we may find that the full implications of humanity's first technology of consciousness are only just beginning to be understood. The inner fire burns on, in every heart that chooses awareness, in every mind that seeks truth, in every soul that dares to participate consciously in the cosmic adventure of existence itself.